The Labor Party has been noted by previous speakers as supporting this legislation. I want to follow on from some of the prior speakers on behalf of the Labor Party, including Charles Chauvel and Pete Hodgson, in relation to the issue of the dangers of a simplistic view of agreement as to what should be our electoral law. If you view consensus as being a desirable attribute of electoral law, and I certainly do, you have to go under the word and define what you mean by appropriate consensus. This bill is an example of consensus because the provisions of this bill do improve the administration of New Zealand's elections in a way that is acceptable to all political parties and a way which is patently fair. New Zealand has, as Pete Hodgson said, a very proud history of having election processes that our public have confidence in. And that's one of the reasons why New Zealand has one of the longest histories in the world of fair and non-violent elections. That is something that we ought to treasure in New Zealand as one of the essential features of our country, because we know that countries that don't have fair elections are more likely to descend into uncivil violence and disorder. So, democracy and fair elections are fundamentally important to peace and freedom from violence in society. That can't be overstated, the importance of democratic process and fair election processes. Now, this bill has broad cross-party support because it does improve the administration of justice, but it doesn't end there. Because in order to have fair process, you actually have to have fair rules as to the running of elections, and those fair rules don't just relate to the agencies that administer elections, but they relate to the rules that apply to the participants in elections. And this government has been very critical of the prior government, the prior Labor government's rules around electoral financing. And they were so critical of them, they said that, look, if we ever elected, we're going to repeal the law. That's fair enough, that's their right as an incoming government. But then they said that we're going to proceed by way of consensus to new laws. Fair enough as an objective. But if you sit there as the government and you refuse to be part of any change, you can say, if that's your definition of consensus, we have no consensus, therefore the status quo will prevail, even though the status quo is patently unjust. The status quo in New Zealand in respect of electoral financing is wrong. Charles Chauvel, in his contribution, gave one example in respect of the upcoming referendum on first past the post. There is absolutely unlimited spending permitted by any interested party in pursuit of their position. Freedom of expression does not mean freedom to buy an outcome. Freedom of expression in New Zealand would be retained by everyone being able to spend 100% of their time, 100% of their time out there in pursuit of their political ideals. But freedom of expression doesn't mean that you can go so far as to say that corporates, for example, should be able to spend unlimited amounts of money in respect of their pursuit of an electoral outcome that might be in their financial outcome, might be in their financial interest. That point was made very wisely, I thought, by, I forget the name of the Supreme Court Justice in the United States who's about to come up to retirement. John Paul Stevens. Thank you, Charles. John Paul Stevens made that point very eloquently in a decision in the Supreme Court of America by saying that if corporates are to have the same rights of individuals, which they are in New Zealand in respect of electoral financing laws, why is it that they haven't got the right to vote? Because plainly a corporate cannot vote. There is a difference between corporates and individuals. There is a difference in principle between a corporate being and an individual. And in New Zealand, we blur that distinction by allowing unlimited spending by corporates in respect of, for example, the referendum on first past the post. The Royal Commission on MMP and related electoral financing matters many years ago now, at the time of the introduction of MMP, made the very obvious point that if you don't have some control on non-political party spending at elections, then you make a mockery of any controls that you have on the political party. Because if the political party can spend to its limit, and then through a separate entity which it controls, and under New Zealand law it can control, it doesn't have to be separate from it, in that separate vehicle it can spend unlimited amounts of money in pursuit of its political ideals to buy an election outcome, then you make a mockery of having any limit in respect of a political party. And if we as a country agree that there ought to be controls on political parties buying election outcomes rather than competing in a contest of ideas, then if you believe in the principles that underlie our limits to election spending, then you must agree that there have to be some controls on non-party expenditure. Otherwise you make a mockery of the controls that there are on political party expenditure. That's what the Royal Commission said. It is patently true. They are right. This is why I make reference to the consensus approach that the national government says that they favour. Consensus doesn't just say we have to all agree in respect to any change from the status quo, because if that's the approach, any one party in this Parliament can withhold a consensus to a necessary change. Consensus requires give and take from all political parties. And in respect of the issues of campaign financing and third-party campaigns and transparency of donations, it is abundantly clear that the Labour Party is willing to give and take. We have agreed to the repeal of the legislation that we have passed. We have acknowledged that it is not perfect, and we have said that we are willing to look at changes. But if the National Party is not, if the National Party is not willing to look at changes from the status quo, then they are the ones that are withholding a consensus. And they ought not to pretend that they are on some plane higher than the Labour Party based on the assertion that there is no consensus to change, because it will be them that is withholding a consensus. And I endorse Pete Hodgson's comments that say that it is beholding on us as a Parliament to actually carry forward this long tradition that we have in New Zealand of fair elections, of peaceful elections, of non-violent elections, which we have a tradition of in New Zealand that is very rare in world terms. In fact, I've heard it said that there is only one country in the world that has a non-violent, non-revolutionary, interrupted democracy as long as we have in New Zealand. And underpinning that is the confidence of the people that we have fair election processes. Fair election processes. And as a consequence, we have a duty in this Parliament, to reach across our political self-interest and to reach reasonable compromises as to what is in our nation's interest. There seems to be general agreement in New Zealand that we ought not to have US-style elections where money buys a result, that there ought to be limits on the amounts that political parties can spend. General agreement in New Zealand on that, even if not in the US. Charles Chevelle says that there's general agreement in the US, but they can't achieve that. 80% of Americans agree that they can't achieve that. We have achieved that in New Zealand. We must hold fast to that as a principle. For that to be real, there have to be limits on how much we spend as political parties and on how much non-political parties spend also. There is also a need for more transparency as to donations. I quite like the idea of the National Party that's floated at the moment about disclosing donations below a certain amount in bands. That's good. But we must, if we're going to have transparency around donations to political parties, if we've got third parties, non-political parties who are electioneering and spending millions of dollars in a campaign, they have to have transparency as to their sources of funds as well. Because without that, they can never escape the imputation that they are being funded by a particular lobby group that is advocating for a particular policy outcome. And that's wrong, that's corrosive of public confidence in election outcomes. So, yes, I support this bill, but I really encourage the government to depart from this fiction that in the absence of universal agreement as to change, we stick with the status quo, because that is not consensus. That is the government hiding behind the status quo to avoid a consensus. Thank you.
Speaker.